Hey y'all, in today's video I'm going to share 5 mistakes people typically make when they are writing grant proposals. Let's get into this one. Hey y'all, this is Tiffany with Boss on a Budget. I help people start their nonprofits and raise money for their nonprofits. If you need help with your nonprofit, you should be subscribed to this channel because I drop videos all the time. And if there's a topic that you have a question about related to startup nonprofits, 9 times out of 10, I've covered it at least a little bit. So make sure you check out my channel and subscribe. And today I'm going to share some common mistakes that people make when they are writing grant proposals. And I'm going to talk from the perspective of people who are new to this, people who have small nonprofits, people who have startup nonprofits, because I know it's hard to find information for people in your shoes. So I'm going to go through 5 different mistakes that people make, but I really want you to make sure you listen to every one, because number 5 especially is the biggest mistake by far, and it's one of the things that I teach about constantly when it comes to grant writing and when it comes to fundraising in general. The first one is not reading the grant qualifications. Now, this is something I want you to understand, because I know some people watching this may not be well versed in writing grants or looking for grants. When you get grants, you're typically getting them from what I call grant funders, but there are different types of grant funders. There are government agencies that are grant funders, and it could be the federal government, state and local government. It could be foundations that give you money, and it could be different types of foundations. It could be a private foundation, it could be a community foundation, a corporate foundation, all of that. And then it could be corporations just in general who give to you directly. And all those different types of organizations are funders, but they all fund differently. And even within the categories I just gave you, they still have different processes for which they ask people to submit applications and submit grants. So I said all that to say is that when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about it generally, but just understand that there are different ways that grant funders request information. But one of the most common things you're going to see across all the funders is a listing of what they're looking for. So if a grant funder, if they have a website, then they're going to tell you what they fund, and sometimes they're going to tell you what they do not fund. It is in your best interest to read that. A lot of people don't. A lot of people just assume that because it's a foundation or somebody gives grants that they're just eligible just because they have 501c3 status or just because they're a nonprofit. But typically a funder has specific types of things they are interested in funding. And if you veer too far out of that, you're just wasting your time. And then sometimes this is what people do, right? They'll be like, well, it doesn't exactly fit, but I'm gonna make it fit, because our program is so great that when they read about it, they're gonna be so astounded and they're gonna be so impressed that they're gonna fund us anyway. And I'm telling you, if you go about it that way, thinking you just can submit a proposal that does not align with what a funder has stated that they're interested in funding in, if you think that's successful, then you're just wasting your time. Now, some people watching this video are going to be like, you are stomping on my dreams, Tiffany. You can't tell me what I can and can't do. Who knows what a grant funder will give me? My program is just that wonderful and so amazing that anybody who reads it is going to fund it. Look here. I am not here on this channel to stop your shine. I'm on this channel to educate. And I'm going to tell you that the majority of the time, if you are submitting a proposal, and that's all you're doing, just submitting a written proposal, and it does not align with what the grant funder specifically stated that they're interested in funding, then you're not going to get funded, and you're barely going to get through to the review process. So I just want you to understand that. Now, there are some caveats to this, just like there's caveats to everything when it's related to nonprofits, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that with number 5. But just if you're just submitting a proposal and nothing else, then I want you to think about why you would waste your time when you know a funder is not going to fund the type of things you do. But one thing you also need to understand before you start writing grants is that you got to be clear on what you do. Because it's so easy to fall into the trap of, well, we can do that. If the funder is asking us or is interested in this type of work, yeah, we could do that. We could figure it out. It's not what we do right now, but we can figure it out. And if you're using that as a way to determine what your programming is by jumping from funder to funder, it's just not a good way to do it, y'all, right? And I'm not saying some people aren't successful at winning grants when they decide to pivot and do something just because a grant funder is interested in it, but what happens after the fact? And then what happens to your identity as an organization? You're just switching up just depending on what funding is available to you. And I don't think that that's a smart, strategic way to have a sustainable organization. So before you even start writing grants, you have to be clear on the type of organization you are and the type of work that you do. And you being clear on that will make it easier to figure out which funders align with you and your interests and which ones don't. And it's really important for you to understand like what you just don't do. There are some things that it's just not in your skill set or it's not in your capacity, and there's going to be a lot of temptation to veer off if a funder is throwing money at something, and you got to decide as a board, as a nonprofit organization, what you're going to do and what you're not going to do, what you're willing to bend and compromise on and what you're not when it comes to pursuing certain things. But all I'm going to say before I get off this topic is it needs to be within your charitable purpose. So remember what you said to the IRS about what you plan to do. And if you're planning to do something that's way off your mission or way off your charitable purpose, I just want you to think more carefully about that before you make a rash or quick decision. So to wrap this one up, because you didn't know I was going to take it this deep, did you? I'll just say, make sure you read the qualifications for a grant before you submit a grant proposal. And sometimes, y'all, depending on the funder, they don't have a lot of qualifications, or you may not know. So they may not have a website and you can't figure out what they do or they don't fund. Then my grants masterclass gives you strategies for figuring out what a grant funder does fund. One of the first places to start is their 990 tax form, but my grants masterclass actually shows you where to find it and shows you how to read that form. So if you're interested in that information, the link to the masterclass is below. The second mistake that people make when they're writing a grant proposal is that they are too wordy. And I talked about this in a video that I recorded just a few weeks ago. I'm linking it above. But sometimes when people write a lot for a paper or for a grant proposal, you're doing it for a couple of reasons. And let me know in the comments if you agree. You may be doing it because you're trying to like meet the word max or whatever, or the word limit. So maybe you got a 500 word limit and you're trying to get to 498 just because you feel like if there's a word limit there, then you got to use it, right? Or sometimes people use a lot of words because it feels like it makes you look smarter, or it makes you look more intelligent because you're using a lot of big words and you're using full sentences and you feel accomplished when you do that. Or you could just be like me. Sometimes when I write, I just tend to write a lot. And I tend to write because of the type of work that I do. I do a lot of focus groups and listening sessions and interviews. I tend to write and transcribe when people talk to me. So that translates into how I write. I write like with run-on sentences a lot. And I write like I'm speaking. And when you are writing a grant proposal, you have to be very careful with how you present what you're writing. You cannot be too wordy. You cannot put a lot of like filler language into the proposal. That's going to sabotage actually your grant proposal. So it's more important for you to be direct and to the point, and try to avoid long run-on sentences. Try to avoid big pieces of text or long passages of text where people can get lost. And if you can say something in fewer words, then you should. If there is a word limit, but you feel like you don't need to use all the word limit, then don't use it. Sometimes people think like the word limit is in there like a trick question. Like, oh, they're daring me to make sure I get as close as possible to the word limit. And you may be thinking that deep, but really somebody else designed the online application and the person who did it doesn't even understand what the application is asking for, and they're just randomly putting in word limits, right? So it could be just that simple, but in your head, you're taking it to another level thinking, oh, they're asking for a lot with this word limit. So the key thing to remember is that there is somebody on the other end of the proposal who's going to be reading this, and they don't know your program well. More than likely, they don't know your program at all. And so you just got to make sure that you're clearly communicating and you're to the point. And the more direct and action-oriented your sentences are, the stronger you appear, right? Not all the words, not all the adjectives and all the fillers, but getting to the point makes a stronger proposal. Number 3 relates to number 2, and it's when you're not being clear with your grant proposal. So one thing you should do when you are writing grant proposals, and maybe not every one, but maybe some of the bigger ones that you have to submit, have somebody else who does not know your program well read the proposal and have them explain to you what you tried to say. Or if you don't have anybody to do that, then put the proposal down for a couple of days and come back to it and read it with a different hat, right? Read it as if you're somebody who is a reviewer, and you don't know the program and you're trying to make sense of what's being said. So if I'm your reviewer and I can't follow what you're saying, or I can't draw connections between one section to the other, if I get to the end of the proposal and I'm still asking, well, what are you doing? Or what's the point of it all? If I am asking those kinds of questions, that's not a good sign. So first of all, you got to be clear around the goals of your work and the impact that it's going to make and why it matters. It's just that simple. I try to talk in simple terms as much as possible because I don't want you to overcomplicate it. And at the end of the day, that's just what it's about. What are the goals of the program? What are you trying to accomplish? And why does it matter? Right? And so if you can't get that point across when you're writing, then it's going to be difficult for people to see why your organization should be funded. It's going to be difficult for them to go to bat for your organization to win among all the other applications that a grant funder may be looking at. So I want you to think about certain strategies you can use to make sure you're being clear. First of all, make sure what you're doing when you're writing, you're connecting different sections, right? So make sure that when you talk about the need statement, for example, and why your organization exists, then you need to make sure when you're talking about the activities and your outcomes that you're connecting it back to why it matters. You're connecting it back to the points that you made for why your organization needs to exist in your need statement. If you need help with the need statement, I'm linking the video above to help you with that. Also, make sure you stay away from jargony words. So when I say jargon or jargony words, that's just words that are typically used in a profession that people outside of the profession would not know what the heck you're talking about. And that could be also related to acronyms. So I work in the child welfare space with foster care, adoption, child abuse and neglect, and we have a lot of acronyms. Our industry, I would say, yes, we got a lot of acronyms, and you cannot make an assumption that somebody reading your proposal knows what those acronyms are. So if you need to use them to shorten your proposal, make sure you're explaining them in multiple sections so people don't get lost. Also, if you have the ability to create tables or figures to be able to graphically represent what you're trying to communicate. Sometimes what you're trying to get across can be done so much easier in a figure or in a graph than it is actually writing it out. So think about how you can use a graphic or something like that. And it also helps because it breaks up the text. So people aren't just reading text after text after text. And this is in particular to those proposals which require a lot of narrative. So just remember, again, as I said in the beginning, that proposals are different depending on the grant funder. So some are really detailed, some are not. But for the ones that are really detailed, make sure you're being clear and you're using figures and graphics to get your point across. And the last thing I'll say on this about being clear, make sure you have somebody who's a good editor to come behind you to make sure that what you're saying is coherent. So sometimes when you're writing in your head, you may feel like what you're saying makes sense or the sentences connect, but a good editor who didn't spend a lot of time writing, who can look at it with fresh eyes, can help draw those connections for you. Make sure you're explaining things thoroughly. Make sure you're connecting across different sections of the proposal. Like I said earlier, that person can do that for you. So also, if you can, leave space when you're writing to have an editor come behind you to help pretty and polish up what you've written. Number 4 is a biggie. It is not aligning your budget with what you put in your grant proposal, which is sometimes called your grant narrative. So one of the first places that grant reviewers look is the budget. And they're trying to see how much that they need to basically cough up based on what you're asking for. But what you're asking for needs to align with what's in the actual numbers of a budget that you submit. So I know that probably 85%, I'm gonna be generous today. I know that 85% of you watching today, because you're new and because you're small and because I know y'all very, very well, I know that most of y'all do not have an organizational budget in place. I know that most of you, when you have a budget, when you're required to submit it as part of a grant, a lot of times that's the first time you ever sat down and created a real budget. And I know that most of you watching this today are probably cringing or your skin crawls at the idea of even creating a budget at all. And this is no shade. This is just what I've seen and what I've experienced. And so I understand why people get nervous about creating budgets, but it's really not that difficult. But the danger in that is that you are not clear for yourself how much your program costs. You don't know how much you really need to ask for. You don't know if you're asking for is actually covering the kinds of things that you plan to do. And you're not giving yourself enough space to be able to create the right program. You want to create an effective program. You don't want to just get by. And part of creating an effective program is having enough resources to finance it. And if you haven't costed out that appropriately, then it's going to be difficult to be as effective as you want to be. You might be having a good program, but are you paying your staff well? Or do you have enough materials? Or are you stressed constantly because you're just getting by because you got to make things work? So you need to, first of all, make sure you just have a budget for your organization and for every program first. If you're trying to figure out where do I get started with grant writing and you don't have any budgets in place, that's where you start. So the first place you start is understanding how much it costs to run each one of your programs. And then when you are writing a grant proposal, making sure that what you're asking for in the grant proposal actually matches up for what you said the program is and what you plan to do. If you have a program that, for example, does one-on-one coaching, so that means somebody has to do that coaching with the people you're working with, and your budget does not reflect having a coach on staff, then that's a disconnect. If you're talking about doing all kinds of travel as a part of your project, but that's not reflected in your budget, that's a disconnect. If you have a bunch of miscellaneous costs in your budget that have nothing to do with running your program, you're just throwing it in there because you think that it should be in a budget, or worse, you're just trying to get it financed through this grant, that is a disconnect. And when there are disconnects and when there are questions, particularly about your budget, and it can't be answered by your budget narrative and by your narrative that you put in your proposal, then that is a red flag for a reviewer. So the best things to do to avoid this is first know how much it costs to run your program, be very clear on how the program is going to be carried out, and make sure those numbers match. And when it's time to submit your budget, make sure that when you're putting in last minute things around what you're supposed to be doing, it matches the actual numbers. So I'm going to give a caveat right here, and I'm going to say that sometimes your program budget, what you have for yourself internally, is not going to exactly match a grant budget. And why is that? Because sometimes when a grant funder is asking for a budget, they may just be asking for a budget for them, for what they're going to pay for, not for what the entire program cost. Sometimes they want to see the entire program, and then they want to see the portion of what they're going to pay and then what other people are going to pay for. Sometimes they only want to see what they're going to pay for. It all depends, right? So that's why it's important to have a standard, like your budget, and then from there, if you need to tweak it, you can do that when you encounter different grant processes. Now, I explained this and I broke this down for how to create a grant budget in my budgeting masterclass. So if you need help with that, make sure you check that link below. And finally, this is the one I know you've been waiting for. The fifth mistake I see people making is not focusing on building a relationship and building your organization's credibility outside of the grant proposal. So if you think that the only way people win grants is by having fancy or well-written proposals, then you are mistaken, right? So the best proposals, the most well-written proposals can be rejected too. And here's the thing, it's not a reflection on your program, it's not a reflection on the proposal necessarily, it's just where the funder is. So maybe the funder had different priorities for this grant cycle and your organization just didn't make the cut. Or maybe they ran out of money and they would have wanted to fund it, but they ran out of money. Or maybe their priorities shifted and they're not exactly trying to do what you're trying to do, even though what you're doing is great. Or even how you described it in the grant proposal is great. There's so many different factors to why funders pick organizations, and a lot of it doesn't have to do with the proposal. So like the proposal backs it up, right? The proposal is a good reference to know what's going to be done, but it's not the only thing. It's not the only factor in you winning. So the question becomes, well, what are the other factors? One of the biggest factors is your organization's credibility, your organization's visibility, and your organization's relationship with that funder. So if that funder knows about you, knows of your work, has been exposed to your work, has some kind of connection to your work, maybe someone who works for them or who's making decisions has seen it real time, has been impacted by it, is connected to it geographically or some other way, then there's more of a likelihood that an organization is going to fund you. If you've taken time to partner with that funder to talk about what their priorities are, to see how your priorities align so you can work together towards a common goal, then it's much more likely that they're going to fund you because they're in conversation with you than not. So building a relationship and also focusing on your credibility so that people are speaking about your organization in the public, that they're talking about the work that you do, that you are amplifying the good work that you do, you're sharing stories constantly about what you're doing, that really matters more than you realize it. So work on that piece, not just finding a grant writer to write you an amazing proposal. So I hope that helped, y'all. I'm trying to give you no nonsense information so you can navigate the startup space. If you need help with your nonprofit, you can visit me at bossonabudget.com. And also if you need help with your nonprofit and you'd like a consultation, I do offer consultation and coaching, and information for that is linked below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.